Hey friends, trying something new. I've been getting some questions about other people's posts in terms of like marketing language and how other people, other coffee companies are describing fermentation. And I thought that this would be a good way for me to address some of those questions and to try and help you figure out what that could possibly mean. So, the one of the posts that I've been getting sent by multiple people is the one from CoffeeNet called White Wine Fermentation. And so many of you have asked me, what does this mean? What are they talking about? And I just want to be clear that when a company is using marketing language, I can't know what that means. I don't know what's in their head in terms of what they're trying to sell. So the only person who can really tell you what that means is the company themselves. But when I see something like that, as a former winemaker, there's a couple of red flags or like bells that come to mind that it's very confusing and I think some misleading language. So the first thing that came to mind when I saw this post was that they were using white wine fermentation, and I wasn't sure if they were referring to the flavors that resulted from the fermentation, meaning that whatever process they did resulted in flavors like white wine, or if they were saying that they use processing techniques that are similar to the processing techniques used in white wine, or potentially both. So if it was both, if they're using white wine processing techniques and that's how they're trying to borrow this term, I think that it's problematic for two main reasons. The first one is white wine and red wine. Some of the biggest differences between those two methods are temperature and skin contact. So the red wine, usually the grapes are crushed and they're put into a tank and they're fermented and macerated with the skin contact in there. That's how we get all of the rich color into the wine. White wine, a really big difference is that usually the grapes are crushed and then they're separated. So the juice and the skin are separated and they don't ferment together. There are some exceptions, but by and large, traditionally white wine is not fermented with the skin. And this method, or this process for CoffeeNet, they're using white wine fermentation for their naturals, which is a skin-on method. So I think that if they were going to use one of these titles at all, red wine would be more appropriate because red wine stays in skin contact the whole time and white wine has no skin contact. The other thing that I found when I looked a little bit deeper into their website is that they're doing these fermentations in sealed plastic bags and they're measuring the temperature inside, which is fantastic. And they also noticed that the temperature inside was around 20 to 23 Celsius. So it maintained a really even temperature and they fermented them in the shade, so potentially cooler, which is a big factor in white wine fermentations, cold, lower temperatures. However, white wine fermentations are much, much colder. They're usually 7 to 10 Celsius, maybe up to 15. They really want to be cold. And again, a red wine fermentation is much closer to the 20 and 23 Celsius. So for terms of skin contact and temperature range, I think red wine is a lot more appropriate. But again, maybe they're not even talking about their processing. Maybe they just mean the flavors that are resulting from this process, or they could also be meaning that they use a white wine yeast for their coffee. And if that's the case, I'd be concerned because again, white wine yeast perform best at low temperatures. And clearly this method with the plastic bag with carbon dioxide is not low enough to be optimal for these white wine yeasts. The other thing that I found really interesting in this post and the information is they said they did 3 different fermentations. Basically, they said the anaerobic, and we know how I feel about that. If not, I have, I think, 2 podcast episodes all about that language. But anaerobic, and then they do an aerobic, and then they also do additional fermentation during drying. And I've had other people reach out asking, is this a new phase or a new method where we can ferment while we dry? Most people think of the fermentation as one stage and then you finish the fermentation and then you go on to drying. But is this an opportunity to blend or potentially extend the fermentation? And in my opinion, I think this is very misleading because as long as you have moisture, you are having microbial activity. There's the potential and the opportunity. And there have been studies that have found that down to 11% moisture, there's still some microbial activity. So it's not necessarily that this company is doing something different or unique or extraordinary. It's just they're finally naming something that almost everybody else is doing. If you are a coffee producer and you are drying your coffee slowly, you are fermenting while you are drying. And this is why those low levels are important, because you can continue to have microbial activity. So you think that you're done drying and then you store your coffee and then some other things can go wrong. So, I would really question this usage, because everybody is always drying while fermenting. So to make it seem like this different process, unless they explain it, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. So those are just some of my thoughts, some of my feedback on this post. Thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something.